to do with Vladimir Putin. Putin is behaving, we're told, much like Hitler did in the 1930s. Indeed, many in the American foreign policy establishment regard him as little more than a gangster. Some would even have you believe he is perpetuating a new Cold War. True, we've reached agreements with him on trade, arms control, and especially the Iranian nuclear weapons deal. But the general picture is grim. Internationally, Russia faces isolation and sanctions. Yet, despite all of this, his grip on his country is stronger than ever. The overwhelming majority of the Russian people today regard Vladimir Putin as a 21st century czar. So what should we do? One view is we should get even tougher with him. We need to draw lines in the sand. As he is inherently untrustworthy, in no way should we cut him a break. His recent meddling in the American presidential election last year would seem to reinforce that point of view. I'd like to take a different perspective. And I do so not as an apologist for Putin, but in an attempt to understand him. To put it bluntly, I believe the Western world must bear some measure of responsibility for Russia's actions since the demise of the Soviet Union. You may say, how so? Well, let's look at Putin's conduct from the perspective of Russian history. Yes, his actions have been unsettling. They have not been irrational, nor do they pose some kind of existential threat to the United States. Rather, he's been acting out against a background of enormous systemic change enveloping Russia over the past 3 decades. To properly understand Russia's recent conduct requires an appreciation of what has happened to that country recently. In the short span between the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 and Putin's rise to power 10 years later, Russia endured decolonization, de-Sovietization, de-collectivism. Few societies have ever undergone such a complete transformation in such a short period of time. Boris Yeltsin's time in office in the 1990s transformed Russia from the country it had been during the Soviet period. The implosion of the Soviet Union created 14 new independent states. Suddenly, Russia was on an equal footing with people who had once been its subjects. The elimination of the Communist Party sent a shockwave through the country. The old guard establishment, what they call the nomenklatura in Russian, was totally unprepared to defend its political ideology in the face of a marketplace of new ideas. The result of all of this was economic, social, and political chaos at home. And in its relations with the outside world, abject weakness and vulnerability. The fall of the imperial state meant the loss of 2 million miles of territory. Tens of millions of ethnic Russians suddenly found themselves living in other countries. What this produced was a palpable sense of disorientation, humiliation, and anger. You may recall Yeltsin turned to the West for help in trying to create a productive, functioning economy. A number of different models were attempted. The problem was no one in the West knew how to liberalize a huge, complex command economy where all decisions had been made from above. In 1996, efforts at reform were floundering. It was then that so-called shock therapy was attempted. Draconian austerity measures were forced upon the Russian economy. They not only failed, they actually exacerbated the situation. For millions of Russians, this reform meant a collapse in basic services, while hyperinflation and corruption reigned supreme. Most Russians didn't blame the corrosion of the old system for this. Rather, they blamed the corruptions of the new. All of this climaxed in 1998 when the severe economic downturn occurred, wiping out whatever gains of productivity had occurred earlier. I know this very well. In the 1990s, I spent a lot of time in Russia. When I first came to Kutztown in 1970, one of the reasons I came to KU is we had the most extensive Russian area studies library in the Commonwealth, including Penn State, whatever. And so during my years at KU, I was fortunate to be able to organize conferences, interactions with scholars, academics on the Soviet Union. As a result of that, going back and forth to New York City, I had the good fortune to meet the head of the Soviet UN delegation, Vladimir Bakarov, who remains today one of my dear friends. He introduced me to some of his colleagues, which ultimately resulted in an invitation to go to Moscow. And over a period of about 11 or 12 years, I was able to meet people over there, to lecture at the Diplomatic Academy of the Russian Foreign Ministry. That's where they train their diplomats. And to do research in the archives of the former Soviet Union. One result of that research you have in the form of a book, 3 copies of which are circulating as I speak. It's at this point that an alcoholic, ailing Yeltsin handpicked his successor, a relatively obscure KGB agent named Vladimir Putin, was plucked out of the woodwork to be his prime minister and ultimately his successor as president. On New Year's Eve in 1999, Yeltsin appeared on TV and said he was about to resign. I'll never forget his words, and I quote, "I am sorry that many of our dreams have failed to come true. I am sorry I did not live up to the hopes of people who believed we could jump out of the gray, stagnant, totalitarian past and into a bright, civilized future. I used to believe it myself." End of quotation. It is with this in mind that one can understand Putin's resentment of the West and his corresponding ambition to establish an anti-Western, conservative, authoritarian state. It's a resentment rooted in his experience of the decline and fall, not of communist ideology, which he never really believed, but rather a decline and fall of Russian power and pride. Putin joined the KGB in 1975 when he was 23 years old. Eventually, he was sent to East Germany. That's where he was when the Soviet Union fell in 1991. When he returned to Russia, things had fallen apart. The multinational empire, shaped by Catherine the Great and Joseph Stalin, was dissolving. The event that gave Putin real legitimacy among his people was the war in Chechnya in 1999. Here was an ethnic group within Russia itself seeking to break away from Moscow. After Chechen terrorists bombed several Russian cities, he took the lead in confronting and ultimately crushing them. As Yeltsin's anointed successor, People latched onto him as their savior. Like the Romanovs before him, Putin presented himself as a gatherer of Russian lands, the man who could and would save Russia from disintegration. Unfortunately, the West sought to take advantage of Russia's weakness. Instead of dismantling NATO, which is something I advocated at the time, we insisted on projecting it toward the Russian heartland to include many of the former satellite states of Eastern Europe. Remember, NATO from its outset in 1948 had been an anti-Russian military alliance. Moreover, we saw no need, a la the Marshall Plan after World War II, to provide meaningful economic assistance to the new Russia. We were free with our advice as to what they should do, but they were essentially left alone to defend for themselves. It was also in the 90s that the former Yugoslavia began falling apart. You recall Yugoslavia had been an artificial creation put together by the Allies at Versailles after World War I. It turned out that the main antagonists in the ensuing civil war were the Croats and the Serbs. Both sought to dominate any new political arrangement that would be forthcoming. Serbia, a Slavic culture, had historically been allied with their fellow Slavs in Russia. When the US and NATO began to wage war against the Serbs in Kosovo, Russia opposed the war. Their wishes were disregarded. Later, they were promised a significant role in managing post-war Kosovo. That too did not happen. The future of Kosovo became a matter for European decision-making. To underline just how humiliating this was for the Russians, in 1996, during a summit meeting in Moscow, President Bill Clinton confided that America's policies were making Boris Yeltsin's political life excruciatingly difficult. In Clinton's own words, and I quote, "We keep telling old Boris, okay now, here's what you gotta do next. Here's some more shit for your face." End of quote. For Yeltsin, it was wearing thin. And I quote, "I don't like it when the U.S. flaunts its superiority," he said. "Russia's difficulties are only temporary, not only because we have nuclear weapons, but also because of our economy, our culture, and spiritual strength. All that amounts to a legitimate, undeniable basis for equal treatment. Russia will rise again. I repeat, Russia will rise again." End of quote. In the face of all of this, is it any wonder that a man like Vladimir Putin will emerge from this period of weakness? From his point of view, the freedoms of the 1990s had damaged Russia tremendously. The specter of disintegration had to be reversed in his mind. Russia could not simply be ignored in the international arena unless Russia was prepared to continue its position as victim. So what happened? At home, Putin set about successfully stabilizing the country and restoring some semblance of order. You may recall, with respect to foreign relations, in the beginning, Putin was relatively solicitous of the West. For example, he was the first foreign leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11. He also looked the other way when Bush was able to obtain in Uzbekistan a military base to facilitate our fight with the Taliban in Afghanistan. He and Bush were also able to reach agreement for a further reduction of their nuclear weapons stockpiles. 2003 was a turning point. That year, 2003, saw Bush's invasion of Iraq and Georgia's so-called Rose Revolution. Georgia had been, you recall, one of the 15 Union republics of the Soviet Union. What happened? Over time, the regime there lost its favor with the people, and the pro-Russian president of Georgia was overthrown. The next year, Ukraine's Orange Revolution got underway, ending in the replacement of that country's pro-Russian president. Putin believed the U.S. had toppled the leaders of these two former Soviet republics. Naturally, he had a strong aversion to seeing anything like that happen in his own country. In 2011, his worst fears seemed to be coming true. In the midst of sliding ratings, anti-Putin demonstrations broke out in Russia's major cities. While managing to suppress the demonstrations, he blamed the United States for fomenting them. In particular, he fingered then Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. I'll come back to that in a moment. In Ukraine, all of this would come to a head. In 2010, Viktor Yanukovych was elected president in a disputed, corruption-laced campaign. One of the issues he had to address was whether to join the European Union. For Putin, this represented an existential threat. He was concerned that with Ukraine in the EU, NATO membership would follow. So in an effort to prevent that from happening, Putin put together his own European Union, if you will. He asked Yanukovych to join, and Yanukovych accepted. This infuriated the pro-Western, anti-Russian portion of the population. Suddenly, anti-Yanukovych demonstrations broke out in Kiev, the capital city. The constitutionally elected Yanukovych was forced into one capitulation after another. Finally, they overthrew him, ran him out of the country. A particularly galling action was when the new government in Ukraine decided to downgrade Russian as one of the two official languages of Ukraine. It is this background that is crucial in understanding what Putin did next. In February 2014, hours after Yanukovych had fled the country, Putin made the decision to invade and annex Crimea. The fall of Yanukovych led Putin to worry about his own power and well-being. After all, if this happened in the heart of the Slavic world, why not Russia next? It should be remembered that Russia, unlike the U.S., has few natural borders with which to protect itself. Russia's rulers have always had to deal with outside threats. From the Mongol invasion of the 13th century to attacks by powerful European neighbors, Russia has been ravaged throughout its history. Napoleon Bonaparte in the early 19th century, twice in the 20th century. It was attacked by Germany. In World War II, suffering between 20 and 30 million lives. For this reason, it has always been in Russia's national interest to have friendly neighbors who could serve as buffers against a hostile outside world. Ukraine has long been viewed by Moscow as one such neighbor. Beginning with the Romanovs, Russia expanded south to the Black Sea, seeking a warm water port from which they could project commercial and political power. The Crimea was early on absorbed into the Russian Empire. Indeed, 60% of its population today are ethnic Russians. The events in the Middle East really set Putin off. You remember the Obama administration's embrace of the uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt. This infuriated Putin. He was especially angry by the U.S.-led assault on Muammar Gaddafi's regime in Libya. From Putin's perspective, this was a classic case study of Western interventionism. Stir up protests, give them rhetorical support and diplomatic cover. If that doesn't work, send in the fighter jets. The epilogue comes in the form of uncontrollable violence and inglorious end for the country's leader. Putin absorbed the death of Gaddafi as an object lesson. Weakness and compromise are impermissible. That is why Putin saw the Syrian civil war as an opportunity to hold a trend that started with the invasion of Iraq. So to summarize, Putin sees a straight line from the West's support of the anti-Moscow color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine to its endorsement of the uprising of the Arab Spring. Moreover, the Russians are convinced that all of this took place as a result of the work of the American Central Intelligence Agency. While we deny it, the Russians believe it. It's a belief that lies at the core of what Putin would do in the 2016 American presidential election. Why did Putin intervene in our election? One overriding reason stands out. Donald Trump has been attractive to people in Russia's political establishment as a disturber of the peace within America itself. Therefore, any support for Trump's presidency that the Russian state can provide is, from their perspective, an appropriate move in their rivalry with the United States. Putin believes Russia has to come up with ways to compensate for its economic and geopolitical weakness. Its traditional levers of influence are limited. Were it not for its formidable nuclear arsenal, it's unclear how important a world power Russia would really be. So then they have to create turbulence within America itself. A country that is beset by turbulence closes in on itself. Witness, for example, the fractious relationship between Trump and our intelligence community during his first year in office. Add to that Trump's early objections to NATO, and you get the point. We can expect, therefore, Putin will not hesitate to use a range of tactics to protect Russia's national interests, especially in its sphere of influence in what they call the near abroad. Recently, and I'll conclude with this, one of Russia's military leaders made an interesting comment. Wars in the future, he said, will be fought with a 4-to-1 ratio of non-military to military means. A 4-to-1 ratio of non-military to military means. A nation's non-military arsenal, he went on, should include efforts to shape the political and social landscape of the adversary. How? Through subversion, espionage, propaganda, and cyber attacks. Most importantly, the Russians have concluded manipulation in the information sphere, including the utilization of so-called fake news, is a very effective tool. Get ready, folks. We're in for a bumpy ride.